very impressive exhibit. It was very well documented. And a photograph from the Hagley Institute, Hagley Museum down in Delaware, still exists. And this is in the book, and it shows the whole lineup at the 1876 Centennial Expo. It was shortly after that Deutz in Germany and Otto developed the four-stroke engine, and the sales of these didn't really take off. And Schleicher reworked the whole structure of what they had there from just a sales office to a production office. And William Maybach from Deutz came over from Germany to help design the smallest horsepower engines, the 2.4 and the 7 horsepower that were available at the time. And that's why those engines resemble the Deutz engines we see from Germany so closely. First engine was the 4 horsepower size. It was built in 1877. A total of 7 engines were built in that year. 2 and 7 horsepower engines were added shortly after, either that year or just after. And 1 year later, there were only up to 20 engines for that year. So the production was really slow, and they were very hard to make, and they had to train people in this country to build them, and as also convince people in the United States that they needed to buy flame ignition slide valve engines. They were very expensive to start with. They had to pay royalties back to Germany for every one they sold, and also the fuels they ran on was very expensive. It cost more to operate these in some cases than steam engines. The selling point was the fact that you didn't have to start a boiler up and make a head of steam to run it. You could just light the flame and start the engine. So that's why a lot of the early ones were used for either pumping water or for printing applications, things of that sort. James Schleicher traveled up and down the East Coast promoting the engines, and it was a very rough start in the beginning, but he did quite well with it, and the company took off after a couple of years. This image here of one of the very first Schleicher-Schum advertisements. And again, it was, in this particular case, it was shown in the printer circular, so they were going for their target market of the printing press industry, where they wanted instant on for a few minutes and then off. So it was, they got their foot in the door. And that's an image that shows up in a couple different publications. This is one of the better ones of a engraving from a photograph of the very first engine. Supposedly that's serial number 1. In 1880, serial number, this engine here was built in 1880, serial number 554. It's 4 horsepower. It's installed in the Hallstatt Observatory in Princeton University. It was used to drive an Edison bipolar dynamo for the purpose of making power to operate the dome on a telescope and operate the shutter. So this engine exists in the Smithsonian Institution. It's not in bad shape. It would need some work to run, but that's the oldest surviving one in the United States. In 1882, they came up with a 10 horsepower engine, and this engine was a completely new design. Although it had some features of the Euro design, it wasn't designed by Maybach, and they used the engineers local to the factory. They changed the slide valve design from the 4 studs and springs that you see on a lot of the Deutz designs and the 2, 4, and 7 horsepower Schleichers to a 2 stud and spring design with a retainer that they call the lobster. This one also has spur and bevel gears, so there were a few variations from this to the other one. Here's an interesting illustration that shows what a lot of the 10 horsepower engines were installed in was an elevator pumping engine, and the elevator 10 horse engine ran a large reciprocating water pump which pumped a water receiver with pressure. And on the right side of the picture you can see a series of pulleys and cables, and there were 2 pistons in there, and the water pump would pump water between the 2 pistons, separate, and you get a mechanical advantage by the wraps of the cable around the pulleys, and the cable would go up to the elevator and pull it up. The literature on those and the lawsuits that occurred from those devices was quite extensive, so I don't think they were very successful. They had a lot of breakdowns, mechanical problems, there were lawsuits, and people that were hurt, and repairs on the engines. So I think a lot of those engines were converted to other purposes. We have a 10 horse slide valve in the field here that was converted to a stationary engine from water pumping service too. So that seems to be the case. And this is the engine I was referring to. It's was started out its life as a water pumping engine and then converted to stationary with a second flywheel added and the water pump removed. Mid-1880s, the 10 horse, like I said, was introduced, and a 1 horsepower horizontal was also introduced. The 1 horsepower was kind of interesting because it resembled the Crosley side crank half horse engine that we see in several instances here in the Flame Expo. One of those does exist today. I'll talk a bit about that in a second. 1882 sales were about 500 each, and that 500 sales, the 500 produced number seems to hold true pretty much all through the slide valve era. So we ended up with an ultimate production of around 3,200 engines or so. In 1883, they came out with 2 twin-cylinder engines, and those were side crank engines. You had a 7 or a 12 horsepower engine on each side of the crankcase.